So class, today we're going to be turning a page in our classroom discussion. So far what we've been doing is looking at ethical theory in general, and what we've been trying to do is to figure out a moral principle that underlies all ethical thought. We've been looking at trying to determine some kind of basic rule that explains the right-making and wrong-making features of actions. And what we're going to do at this point is we're going to turn away from looking at ethical theory in general and focus on some specific applied ethics and issues. Due to the compressed nature of this course, it's only a 10-week course as opposed to a 16-week course, we're not going to be able to focus as much attention on this as I would like. But what we're going to do is we're going to turn to two issues in particular. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the issue of abortion, and then once we're done with that, we're going to spend a week on talking about euthanasia. Now, a good question you might ask yourself at this point is, why do we spend so much time talking about ethical theory? Why do we spend so much time talking about them if in the end it turns out that neither one of them seem to be totally correct? If you recall, utilitarianism seemed to have a lot of problems with it, and it didn't seem exactly satisfactory in the end. But the same can be said for Kantianism. His moral philosophy also. There's some appeal to it, a lot of appeal in fact, but in the end it was highly problematic as well. So why did we focus so much attention on ethical theory and trying to figure out an ethical theory if neither one of them were correct? If you recall, I kind of dangled this carrot in front of you and said, hey, we're going to look at these theories because it'll help us when we turn to these applied issues. Well, the reason we looked at these theories is because they're actually really informative, not insofar as they tell us what we need to do or how we need to reason positively, but they tell us really about what extremes or what pitfalls to avoid. Sometimes we can learn a lot, not just by studying where things go right, but also by studying where things go wrong. So to use an analogy here, imagine for instance you were studying civil engineering. If you did this, you'd learn about how to make bridges and build roads and this sort of thing, how to construct buildings. But you wouldn't just study the correct way to do this, you'd also study the incorrect way to do this. Why? Because you want to know what mistakes to avoid. You want to know if you do a certain thing, well, this will cause a building to collapse. Or if you do this other thing, it'll cause a bridge to collapse. There was actually one famous bridge that collapsed because it was built over a river or as a deep chasm, and what caused the bridge to collapse was that the wind was passing over it, and it had created a certain kind of, or it hit the harmonic resonant frequency of the bridge, and it caused the bridge just to start to sway and flow until the whole thing collapsed. The bridge, right before it collapsed, it actually looked like it was a huge concrete and steel bridge, but because of the way the wind started passing over it, it created this frequency effect where the bridge looked like a slinky going up and down. And I think engineers had calculated that if the bridge had just been built 4 inches higher or lower, then that could never have happened. And see, that's the kind of thing, it's like, okay, we learned from where something was a mistake or where something failed. And we can say the same thing for Kantianism and utilitarianism. Both of them capture something, I think, that is embedded in the ways that we ordinarily reason. The theory of utilitarianism, it really focuses on what is good for society, you might say. But it does it to the expense of the individual. Whereas Kant, he really focuses on the individual, but sometimes to the extent of what is not good for the group as a whole. And there's really no easy way to figure out how to balance these two moral theories. In fact, this has been kind of the holy grail of modern ethics. How do we balance a utilitarian view with a Kantian view? And there's no easy way to do it, but I think it's really instructive because oftentimes what I hear when people talk about these applied issues that we're going to be looking at is they focus solely on one of the two. I think people, they a lot of times they have, intuitions that they never really thought too much about. And so you'll hear people say stuff like, well, it's all about what's for the greater good. Or some people will say, well, it's all about rights. And what we've seen is both of those things seem important. The greater good is important, but rights are important. And I don't think any adequate ethical theory is going to be all or one of the other. It's going to have to be some weird way of balancing these two out, and I don't know exactly how to do that, and I'm not really sure that anybody else does either. But as I said, we're going to move away from talking about these kinds of deep ethical theories, and we're going to start focusing on a very controversial issue, and that is that issue of abortion. And I know this is something that a lot of you have thought about, you have opinions about, you've probably talked about in other classes. I've been told by students they're sick of talking about it because they spend so much time talking about it in other classes. I understand that, but it is an important issue. It's one that refuses to go away. And what we're going to do in this class is maybe talk about it to a certain level or depth that you haven't done it in other kinds of classes. And so hopefully it will provide new insight into the debate. This is a debate, as I said, that you're probably familiar with, and it's a deeply divided debate. It is one of all the things I talk about in all my ethics classes and all my philosophy classes. Honestly, the issue of abortion is one that conjures up the most deeply passionate feelings by people on both sides of the aisle. Sorry, I hit the button too soon. It's one that I see people more willing to just lash out at one another over. And this is a debate which honestly has been raging. You might think this is something that's a recent kind of debate, but it's one that's been going on for a very, very long period of time. In fact, if we go all the way back to ancient Greece, we'll see that we had the views basically what we have nowadays. We have both pro-life and pro-choice positions. So here we have Plato, and you can see the dates when Plato lived. He lived roughly 400 BC. And Plato, he endorsed what we could consider a fairly radical pro-choice position. What Plato says right here is that he says that parents, if a woman is pregnant, that they should not bring anything to light whatever thus conceived, on the understanding that they cannot rear such an offspring. He actually, what he says here, I skipped over a part because I wanted to save the kind of more radical thing. But basically what he's saying here is he said that if parents can't raise a child, if they know they can't afford it, then they should not even bring to light anything thus conceived. So basically they should have an abortion if they know that they can't afford to raise a child. And the more radical part is right here. He says if they are unable to prevent the birth, then they should dispose of it on the understanding that they cannot rear such an offspring. So he actually said if you can't have the abortion, but you know you can't afford it, then once it's born, you should kill it. So his view is actually fairly radical, much more radical than I think most people in the United States are willing to adopt, even people who consider themselves pro-choice. But nonetheless, we do have a pro-choice position, a very extreme one, being represented in antiquity. We also have a pro-life position right around the same time. Some of you have probably heard of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. Well, that was originally authored by a very famous ancient Greek doctor named Hippocrates. And what he said about abortion, he says right here, this is actually part of the original Hippocratic Oath. He said, I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Similarly, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy. So this was part of the oath that doctors were supposed to take in ancient Greece. That they would not, or at least ones who followed in the school of Hippocrates, is that they would not give an abortive remedy to a woman. They considered that a violation of their sacred oath as doctors. And the reason I mention these two figures is just to show you that this is a debate that's been going on for a very, very long time. On the one hand, there have been people from over 2,000 years who thought abortion was permissible. There have also been people for 2,000 plus years who thought it was wrong. And in fact, if you go back even further, we see societies that were even more ancient than the Greeks. They had, in some of them, certain laws against abortion. Some of them didn't have laws against abortion. It's just something that people have always been deeply conflicted about. And it's one that people are still deeply convicted about. Some of you who are fairly young might not remember this, but I remember this when I was a child. But back in the 80s, in fact, you would have people who were against abortion. There were a couple of cases where they had blown up abortion clinics. There were a few cases where abortion doctors had been murdered. And you can see the reason I mention this is just to highlight how deeply passionate some people are about this. People who are against abortion, in many cases, this is the moral issue for them. This is something of just central importance. And likewise, on the other side of the aisle, you see people who are support abortion. They consider this to be just a fundamental right of women to be able to have an abortion. And it's something they take very, very, very seriously. And so I mention this and just highlight something that's probably very familiar to a lot of you of how deeply passionate this discussion is, just to say a couple of important things before we get too far into it. And the first thing I want to say here is just that let's please keep this conversation civil as we move forward. No personal attacks are going to be allowed, especially in your discussion post. I expect that not everybody in here is going to have the same opinions about the matter, but and it's perfectly okay to raise objections and to make criticisms of other people's arguments, of their points of view. But I don't want you to attack anyone personally. You might say something to the effect like, I don't think your argument is persuasive, and here are the reasons why, or I respectfully disagree with you, and here are the reasons why. But don't call someone a baby killer. Don't call someone a misogynist. Don't call someone any kind of personal name. That's not allowed in this class. So let's just please keep it civil. Remember, the person that you're communicating with on the other end of the line is a living, breathing human being. So don't say anything in your discussion boards that you wouldn't say in person to another person. And in fact, some of you might say some things that you shouldn't say. So just talk to people in a very civil, professional way. That's one thing I want to say, just as a friendly reminder. Something else I want to point out too, and I think this is really important, is that what I find is that very seldom do people change their opinions when we discuss this. Very seldom do I see people change their points of view at all. In fact, I just want to go back a slide I skipped here. This is a Gallup poll, and I don't know, this is a couple years old now, but as you can see right here, public opinion in the United States has been basically split even, 50-50 for the last 20 or so years. You've had roughly 50% of the country who've been pro-choice and roughly 50% of the country who recognize themselves as pro-life. Has remained fairly static. And I find that to be true, that people with their own opinions, they don't change them that often. That people, even after having a discussion like the one we're going to have, kind of hold to the views they had prior to starting the discussion. But what I want to do is challenge each and every one of you to at least consider the possibility that you might be wrong in your point of view. To at least take your opponent's position seriously, and to at least be open to the possibility that maybe what you believe isn't correct, and that what the other person believes may very well be correct. Now, I'm not saying that you have to change your mind. I'm not saying that you have to agree with the positions I adopt. That's not what's important to me. But it is important that you at least you have some kind of self-awareness of your own view, that you're open to a kind of critical self-distance of your view, that you can recognize problems with it, that you can recognize someone who holds a view that's different from yours, that they do so, and they might have very good reasons for holding the view that they hold. I love this quotation I have here from Aristotle, and what he says is, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." And that's really all I'm asking out of you, is just to be able to entertain your opponent's thought, to understand where they're coming from, to understand the reasons they have for adopting it, to understand the reasons they have for criticizing your view. Even in the end, if you reject their view and you think their reasons aren't persuasive, at least be able to entertain it, but you don't necessarily have to accept it. So those are the two kind of prerequisites I want to offer for our discussion. Now, I'm going to give you some really basic information and go over some basic terminology that we're going to be using throughout our conversation about abortion. And, a couple of these points, they're just, or a couple of these distinctions, they're just, really basic things. But in our class, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking quite extensively about whether or not the fetus is a person. We're going to be talking about that. And I just want to be clear about how we're going to be using the term fetus, because we're going to be using it in a somewhat imprecise way. Technically, a fetus is, I don't know how to say this, but a fetus is what we describe as the unborn child from week 8 until delivery. Prior to actually having a fetus, we see the zygote as what exists at the earliest stages. That's the first 2 weeks. Then we have the embryo at weeks 2 through 7. But just for the sake of convenience, we're just going to say the fetus is what is present from the moment of conception until delivery. So we're not going to use fetus in a strict biological way. We're going to use it in a much broader way. This isn't just laziness on my part. This is consistent with all philosophical literature on the matter. It's consistent with legal literature on the matter. You don't typically see people splitting these kinds of hairs about the fetus, the embryo, the zygote, because for most people, they typically consider all the relevant moral and legal issues that would pertain to the fetus to equally pertain to the embryo. Now, that assumption might be incorrect. And we could talk about that later, but I'm just letting you know up front, because I know some of you especially are going to nursing school, so you're a little more familiar with the distinction between, and some of you have had children, so you're more familiar with the distinction between zygote, embryo, and fetus. But those aren't going to be sets of distinctions that really matter too much to us as we move forward. We're just going to say the fetus. And if there comes an occasion where we need to make a more fine-grained distinction, then we can do so on that occasion. I also just want to point out a few important facts about fetal development. Some of this is fairly basic, I know, and for some of you especially who have had children, this is probably very familiar. I guess I point out some of this more for the men out there, because I've noticed that us dudes tend to be kind of ignorant about fetal development. In fact, someone asked me recently how old my nephew was, and I think I said he was 5, and my girlfriend looked at me and goes, "He's 10." I don't know. It's just, I find that we tend to, I don't know, we're just dumb sometimes, us men. Maybe not all. Maybe it's just me. So maybe I'm just, saying this, pointing out these distinctions just for myself. But when we talk about fetal development, this is typically divided into trimesters. And as I'm sure some of you know, pregnancy, it takes 9 months or roughly 40 weeks. The first trimester occurs from weeks 1 through 12. And you can see here that we have several things begin to develop. Certain major organs, neural tube, fingers, toes, ears, ankles, wrists, eyelids, and the heart begins to beat around week 5. During the second trimester, which this occurs from weeks 13 to weeks 28, you have the development of genitals. The fetus begins to move, kick, swallow, turn over. What is known as the quickening, which is where the mother can actually feel fetal movement. This occurs during this time. We also have during this time, and this is something that actually there's quite a bit of debate about, but the fetus becomes what is called viable. This occurs somewhere around week 24. And what viability means is basically the fetus can live outside of the mother's womb. Now, this is something that is up for debate as to when the fetus actually does become viable. The truth is viability has changed over the years due to increases in medical technology. But there is some debate about that. People who are very, very pro-choice, they think the moment of viability should be considered earlier. People who are more pro-life, they think it should be considered a little bit later. During this time, also, the fetus, we're told, can experience pain. The fetus actually develops brain waves much earlier. Obviously, the exact moment when brain waves begin is going to depend on the fetus. But at a certain point, the fetus's brain starts to develop such that it can experience pain. Now, truthfully, we can't be 100% sure if the fetus ever does experience pain or can experience pain, because we can't simply just ask it and say, hey, fetus, are you experiencing pain? And it can tell us. It just doesn't have that ability. So the way that scientists think that we can determine that a fetus experiences pain is just this, is that when a human when I say human, sorry for that, when an adult experiences pain, certain sections of its brain light up on a CAT scan. So when we take a fetus, when it gets to a certain level of development, those same regions of their brains can light up. And so we infer that since those same regions are lighting up, that it too must be experiencing pain. And again, this is something that is subject to debate. I've heard some people say that a fetus can experience pain as early as week 20. I think that most doctors and scientists say that it's a little bit later. I've heard it as late as week 28. But somewhere in there is where a fetus can experience pain, somewhere between 20 and 28. But I want to say that what I've heard is most recent consensus is somewhere around week 24, but that's something that also is changing a little bit as we learn more about the brain. That moment is being kind of pushed around. So, and then finally, the final stage of development is the third trimester, and this is weeks 29 through 40, and that's some basic things about fetal development. Now, there may come a point later on where we need to talk a little bit more and get more into the nitty-gritty of fetal development. But for right now, what's important is just that we're aware that there are these 3 trimesters that occur. So when we talk about the important questions of abortion, we can roughly divide those questions into 2. And on the one hand, we have what we can call legal questions that pertain to the issue of abortion. And on the other, we have philosophical questions. And there's a lot of overlap between these two. And legal questions, a lot of times, these are informed by and rely on answers to certain kinds of philosophical questions. But the basic kinds of legal questions are going to be things like, is it lawful or constitutional for states to pass laws against abortion? And if so, under what conditions can states pass laws against abortion? So when we talk about the legal questions, we're really talking to a large extent about when is it permissible for laws to exist to regulate abortion. But apart from when it's permissible for these laws to exist to regulate abortion, we can also ask questions that are of a more philosophical nature. Things like, well, even if abortion is legal, is it moral? Does a woman do anything immoral if she has an abortion? There are also other kinds of philosophical rights that we can, philosophical issues that we can ask about how do we weigh and balance the rights of the mother against the rights of the unborn fetus. In fact, there is a deeper philosophical question we can ask is, what rights does the fetus have at all? Is the fetus a person? Yes or no? If the fetus isn't a person, does it have any kind of moral rights? If the fetus is a person, then what rights does it have at that point? So there are these deeper philosophical issues that we could address also. And just to show you something that I think is kind of interesting here is we look at some Gallup polls here, and you notice that this line right here. The question is, do you think abortion should be legal? And they give you three options: under any circumstances, so legal under any circumstances, legal only under certain circumstances, or illegal in all circumstances. And so legal under any circumstances, and basically what this means is it should always be legal. Abortion should be legal no matter what. And this is a view that very few people hold. Only 26% of people say abortion should be legal under any circumstances, no matter what. Most people are really averse to a woman having what we call late-term abortions, so abortions in the third trimester. Most people would be really averse to a woman, for instance, having an abortion 8 months in for the reason that she wants to, I don't know, maybe something silly like having the birth would obstruct a trip she had planned to London or something. So she wants to have an abortion even though the fetus is 8 months along. Most people would not like that. So they would say, well, there need to be some kind of restrictions on abortion. And in fact, the Supreme Court, in all the cases that have ever been decided, it's never been the case that abortion should be legal no matter what. The Supreme Court has routinely upheld this idea that states can pass laws to regulate abortions in certain cases. So this is a minority opinion here that it should just be completely legal no matter what. But 26% of the population says legal no matter what. A smaller portion of the population says that it should be illegal under any circumstances. So this line right here says illegal in all circumstances. And most people think that abortion should be legal in some circumstances. Most people are willing to say that, yeah, if the fetus threatens the life of the mother, or if the fetus is a product of rape or incest, abortion should be permissible. But some people say, no, even then, even if the fetus threatens the life of the mother, it should be illegal, which would be this 20% right here. More people say, that it should be legal under certain circumstances. But what I want to show you, and this is the point of showing this graph here, is that we have 51% of the population who says legal under certain circumstances, and 26% who say legal no matter what. And so if you look at these two together, you're going to see that we have roughly 77% of the population saying, yeah, abortion should be legal, at least some of the time. You have the overwhelming majority of the population saying, yeah, there should be allowances when abortion is legal. Now, with that in mind, look at this. And people are asked, do you think abortion is morally acceptable, morally wrong? Depends on the situation, not a moral issue. Anyways, people who think abortion is morally acceptable, notice only 38% who were asked said it was morally acceptable, and 51% said it was morally wrong. Now, I find this really, really interesting because what you see is that the majority of the U.S. population thinks abortion should be legal, but the majority also thinks it's morally wrong. And this is something I've frequently heard people say, is that they find abortion personally to be wrong, but they think it should be legal. Now, whether or not that view is consistent, I'll leave it for you to decide later on. But I do point this out because we can see that there is a disconnect, that there's a division here between the legal questions and the philosophical questions that pertain to the issue of abortion. Now, in our class, we're going to focus strictly on the philosophical questions. I don't have a lot to say about the legality of abortion. This isn't a law class, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about that. There might be a few instances where that's important, and so I'll mention it when legal questions do come to bear. But for the most part, we're going to focus just on the philosophical issues. Now, I want to say something very quickly also about the terminology we're going to be using, because the terms pro-life and pro-choice are very, very common terms, and in fact, I've been using them already. As I've said, a lot of you may already identify with one group or the other, but I really don't like these terms. I mean, they're very ambiguous, and they're ambiguous in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, they're ambiguous because pro-life or pro-choice could refer either to one's legal position or it could refer to one's moral position. For instance, you might say, well, look, I'm personally pro-life, but legally pro-choice, right? So if someone just tells you something like, I'm pro-life, I'm like, well, what does that mean? Or is that just your personal view, or is that your legal view? I mean, it could be either one. But not only that, these terms, both of them cover a wide range of different views. And what you find is that some people describe themselves as pro-life, and that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For instance, some people describe themselves and they say they're pro-life, and they have very, very radical view. They'll say things like, I don't think that abortion is morally right, even if it threatens the life of the mother, right? No matter what, abortion is wrong. Some people describe themselves as pro-life, and that would be the most extreme pro-life position. Then some people say, well, I'm pro-life. I think abortion is wrong in all cases except when it threatens the life of the mother. And so this view is a little softer, a little less extreme than the previous one, except they still think abortion is wrong in cases of rape or incest. So that would be a strong conservative position. And then some people describe themselves as pro-life, and they say, I think abortion is wrong, except in cases where it threatens the mother's life or rape and incest. And so they would think abortion is wrong in all cases but those couple I just mentioned, rape, incest, or threatens the mother's life. And so you can see that is a pro-life position, and yet it's a little less extreme than the others. And so when someone says, hey, I'm pro-life, to me, when I hear that, I'm thinking, I don't really know what your view is based on what you just said. That term you're using is just so broad. It could cover a lot of different things. And the same can be said for people who are pro-choice. Some people describe themselves as pro-choice, like Plato I mentioned earlier. He would be, according to some, pro-choice, and you do see people adopt views very similar to his own. Some people say a woman should be able to have an abortion at any point, no matter what, and for any reason. The reason doesn't matter. If a woman is, let's say she is on the delivery room table and she hasn't given birth yet, and she says, I want to have an abortion right now, some people would say that's her right, she should be allowed to do just that. And that would be a very extreme pro-choice position. Some people would say even once she's delivered the child, she should be allowed to terminate it. This is what is called infanticide, as some of you know. But some people adopt this point of view. They say even once the child is born, a woman has a right to terminate its life. And this would be a very, very, very radical pro-choice view. Then we have some views that are a little less extreme that say, well, I think a woman should be allowed to have an abortion in all cases except late-term abortions, right? And that would be a less radical pro-choice view. And you're going to have gradations of this view just like you had gradations of the pro-life view. And the reality is the closer we get to the center, the less real difference there is between these two. But I do highlight all of this just to say these terms are a little sloppy, and they can lead to a lot of confusion because I think sometimes even the people using them don't even understand or completely know the views that they themselves adopt. And so sometimes they're criticizing someone, they're like, well, I'm pro-life and you're pro-choice, and really the distance between them is not always as great as they might think, or the terms might lead them to believe. So to some extent, these terms are inescapable. They're so deeply entrenched, it's going to be almost impossible to avoid using them. But I just want to share with you some terminology that I kind of created. You're not going to find anywhere else that I'm aware of. But I'm just going to share this with you so you can see maybe a little more clearly some of the differences between the various views that exist. And I want to be clear that these terms are not meant to be in any way derisive of any sort of view or critical of any view or endorse any view. I came up with these terms just as a way to describe views, and these are by no means the only views that exist. But what I'm calling the standard position is going to be something like this. Abortion is permissible early in pregnancy, and later in pregnancy, abortion is only permissible in cases of rape, incest, or where it threatens maternal health in some way. And when I talk to most people, this is kind of the sense I get of the view that they adopt. They say, well, if you're going to have an abortion, the time to do it is early on. once the fetus reaches a certain level of development, you shouldn't have an abortion unless it's a product of rape, incest, or maybe it threatens, or not maybe, but it threatens the life of the mother. And then we can have what I'm going to call a liberal position, and this says abortion is permissible at any point during pregnancy. We can have the conservative position, and this is abortion is only permissible in cases of rape, incest, or where pregnancy poses a serious threat to maternal health. We can have what we call the extreme liberal position, which says abortion is permissible at any point during pregnancy, and infanticide is also justifiable. And then finally, we have what I'm calling the extreme conservative position, which says abortion is not permissible at any point, even if pregnancy threatens the life of the mother. And between, let's say the conservative position and the extreme conservative position, there are going to be a host of other positions there. And likewise, between the liberal position and the extreme liberal position, there are going to be a host of different positions there. In fact, later on, I'm going to mention one I call the strong conservative position, and that one falls in between the conservative and the extreme conservative position. I'm going to tell you, I'm probably going to have a hard time avoiding those terms pro-life and pro-choice. Like I said earlier, they're just so embedded in the way we talk about these things. They're almost inescapable. But the reason I list these different terms up here in these different positions is just to highlight all the various differences between points of views that people have. And the differences tend to rely on basically what people consider to be the exceptions or the instances where abortion is permissible or is not permissible. So I just wanted you to keep these differences in mind as we move forward with our discussion.